Thank you very much, Daisy, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me this great honour. So, the issue of urbanisation, and according to Professor Daniel Hornwig from the University of Ontario, this is one of the world's most important phenomena. In 1913, throughout the world, 10% of our population lived in cities. Currently, 2013 figures show that we're up to 50%. And over the next 35 years, this is moving towards 75%. And even if you take the UK example, approximately 90% of the population is urbanised. So with that brings massive challenges. Challenges of well-being, and we've discussed it this morning. Challenges of the infrastructure impact, the critical infrastructure, the pressures being placed on that. The issues of doing more with less space. And how we're going to develop smarter cities, more improved cities, again, for the betterment of our citizens. So this is a citizen-centric issue that we have to face into, this urbanisation. And taking this, for example, within London, this whole issue of how London has changed over the last 100 years and where that's going to. 1911 showed that there was a huge level of urbanisation within London, but it was a different type of urbanisation. It wasn't the well-being situation that we have today. Today we have a very similar or almost slightly growing population within London, but we have this increase in well-being. We've had a huge commercialisation, and also we've had the issues of pressures being put on our critical infrastructure and how we're going to respond to this. This places this whole issue of cities working in a system of subsystems. The infrastructure related to each other, the interconnectedness of this infrastructure is absolutely of critical importance. Again, linking to this is the whole issue of what this urbanisation is doing for issues of security. And we're not talking about security of not only of the people themselves, but issues of food security, energy security, issues of climate change, public health and disease, economic development and trade. All of these issues have to be considered within this globalisation, within the security, and how resilience and the resilience cycle can improve this to make it a better place to live and work. It is a complex environment. An urban environment is a very complex situation. Again, I refer to the concept of a system of subsystems. Cities and their supporting infrastructure are increasingly interconnected and interdependent. If you take a very simple analogy of our tube network and how that is very much interconnected. And there's a challenge there looking at urban resilience, of how this resilience and the resilience of infrastructure can either safeguard its global stability or else be an exemplar or an amplifier of these cascading shocks. And the more cascading shocks that mount, the more disasters and threats that can result. So we have to focus on the stability as opposed to the cascading effects. And a very interesting statistic that we've come across is this: by 2030, London's population will have grown will have increased from 33 to 38 boroughs in terms of population, but still having to be maintained within our 33 boroughs. So we've had this issue of increased capacity, increasing in brown infrastructure, increasing the provision of good, affordable, quality housing. Again, these are of critical importance when we look at the future options and the future challenges that is facing London. And with this is the whole issue of affordability. And again, we've had this discussion this morning, how the affordability crisis of housing in London is rapidly increasing. Again, 2013, house prices in London are 6 times increasing, over 6 times faster increase than over income. And if you just take two very simple examples of earnings and house prices, comparing London with the national average, the London earnings is approximately 25% higher than the national average earnings. However, when you compare it with house prices, it's almost 300% higher. And that is a massive issue to be addressed in going forward, in not only in the increasing population, but also in the issues of retaining high-quality staff at an affordable level so they can actually live and work and purchase the required housing. With that is the whole issue of infrastructure demand and what is considered is our key infrastructure. Within the Irish context, we are currently devising a forum that is actually addressing the issues of what is our key infrastructure, our critical infrastructure, categorising these and ranking these and placing an importance on them. And if you take, for example, the London Tube is a critical piece of London's infrastructure for the movement of people. For the demand on the Tube has grown by over 10% in the last 5 years, carrying, for example, in 2012, 36 million extra movements, which is absolutely phenomenal when you think of it. So that alone and this interconnectedness with the rest of our infrastructure is of key importance in terms of the resilience cycle. And I will come on to the resilience cycle briefly. Again, looking at investment, the work done by London First at a conference earlier this year in March, they expressed the concern and requirement for London to develop as an economic growth engine for the future as a global city. However, very startling statistics have come about of the actual investment in infrastructure in London. With approximately 7% of the taxation of London is retained for infrastructure. And if you compare that to New York, it's 7 times that. Almost 50% of New York's taxation is retained for investment in its infrastructure, which is a phenomenal statistic when you think about it in the London context. So again, that needs to be borne in mind about how we're going to provide for future infrastructure provision, again, to maximise the economic growth potential and its growing population. This brings us about to this whole definition of urban resilience, and actually what is urban resilience. And this definition has somewhat sprung from our understanding of sustainability, which came about in the late 1980s. And sustainability has kind of moved towards this definition of resilience. And kind of one of the most recognised definitions now within the urban context is the capacity of a city's economic, social, political and physical infrastructure systems to absorb shocks and stresses and to retain their basic function and structure. So it's not only its ability of the capacity of the system from its physical side, but also from the social, the political and the economic side. So again, it's a very integrated process, going back to the concept of a system of subsystems. And this has led on to other accepted definitions. It's the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and ability to recover and withstand, again, from shocks. But it's not only to recover, but it's to improve, to bounce forward, to learn from this resilience turn of where we're actually going to in the future and how we can improve on our situation through the greater knowledge, the understanding within this resilience cycle, within this resilience definitions. There is a well-known understanding that's been put forward of these urban resilience concepts. And it's interesting to look at these concepts individually, but I've attempted to group them here with the group over here on my far right, looking at the whole issue of thinking, the concept, the process and the approach. On this side here, on the left-hand side, looking at the principle, the quality of the system and the response, and bringing those two together to bring it into the bottom three there, looking at the practice, the policy, and how we can prepare a strategy for the whole resilience cycle within these perceptions. Again, and the grouping of these perceptions to give real reality, real definition to our cities going forward. The evolving scope and focus. And this brings me very nicely onto this whole resilience cycle. It's well recognised that we have 4 stages of a resilience cycle. We have the mitigation, the preparedness, the response and the recovery. And I'm going to show you some examples of cities now that are in different stages of this cycle. But again, it's very important that this cycle is iterative. It learns from the previous stages, it moves on and readapts and reinvents and learns from itself. So looking at some examples of where we are in this cycle, Curitiba in Brazil can be considered within stage 1 and 2 of this cycle in the mitigation and preparedness. Copenhagen, again within the mitigation. Oslo, again from its effects of the bombings in the last decade, is in stage 4 in the actual recovery period. Again, Christchurch from the event of the earthquake is in stage 4, Rotterdam from the flooding stage 3, and London itself is at an early stage of actually mitigating and preparing for itself, for this growth, for this population growth, its economic growth within the preparedness and mitigation stages. And in particular, looking at some of these cities in detail, again, looking at the measuring of success of urban security within Rotterdam, the sustainable innovation, urban planning within Curitiba, Copenhagen looking at towards a carbon neutral city. And very interestingly, San Francisco, earlier this year in April, was the first city in the world to appoint a chief resilience officer. And many, many cities are following this concept now of actually appointing this resilience officer. So this is really at the forefront of thinking this whole resilience concept. And it ties very neatly in with Sir David's point about the catapult and where that's moving to within this resilience cycle. So this ongoing debate of matching security and efficiency to be more resilient. And I put up an example here of Beijing's airport, an airport-style security at the subway stations in May 2014. And even some of you can reflect on your travels maybe here this morning using the underground and how we're looking at this issue of increased security but at the effect of efficiency. Quite an interesting concept and how we're moving towards this, but yet we need to be people-centric in all of this, in all of these issues. And then looking at the whole issue of risk and how we as a city, as city planners, city architects, city economists, how we look at this type of risk and how do we mitigate against this, how we plan, how our urban form changes towards this. And again, looking at the example of Oslo and how they had a very integrated, say, governance system of building structure. And the bombings in Oslo affected very severely that whole infrastructure and many institutes of that governance, of that system, where now should we be thinking about a more dispersed governance within cities. But with that comes the issue of critical mass, economies of scale. Do we disperse or do we remain in a very confined space? So again, we need to think about these concepts as we are changing, as the cities are going through this dynamic change. And there's a need for harmonisation within London, this whole issue of harmonisation moving forward. Again, looking at work being done by the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. And they're talking about issues of risk reduction, climate change, adaptation. They're inextricably linked. And London needs to think of these in a harmonious way to increase collaboration, integrate strategies, looking at stronger and better governance and innovation. And we discussed all these again today. So it's reaffirming what is going on at a global level. And finally, I'd just like to bring you on to the work that we're doing. It fits very neatly in this whole resilience cycle, in this whole increased security cycle and what it means for global cities. So we're putting forward this issue of looking at the capacity of large-scale infrastructure to withstand, resist and reduce impacts of sudden extreme events in terms of magnitude, duration and external effects. And actually London and the whole London Bridge and Shard area is one of our case studies within this. And what we're doing here is we're actually introducing and integrating the resilience cycle, our 4-stage cycle, with what is considered the planning, the design and operation of a city and the cycles that goes through, and integrating those two systems together. Finally, I'd like to thank you for listening to me this morning. I think it's a great opportunity for us, and I would like to just draw your attention to a fringe session that we're running at lunchtime today, where we can further discuss these issues. So thank you very much for your time.